The chandeliers glittered above the grand hall, their golden light spilling across silk drapes and polished marble floors. Laughter, music, and the faint clinking of glasses filled the air as one of the wealthiest men in town made his entrance. But tonight all eyes weren't just on him. His arm was linked with a woman, graceful, calm, dressed in an elegant gown that shimmered under the light. Yet behind the sparkle of her appearance the murmurs began. "Wait, is that really her?" One voice whispered from the corner. "Impossible. She used to be nothing. Just a poor girl." Another scoffed, unable to hide the disbelief. Everyone mocked her. How can she stand here now as his wife? The whispers rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass, spreading shock and curiosity in equal measure. People exchanged glances, their words barely restrained. Some looked with envy, some with suspicion, and a few with quiet guilt, remembering the times they had insulted her, turned her away, or laughed at her misfortune. The rich man walked forward with pride, his grip firm as though daring anyone to challenge their presence. The woman, however, remained silent. Her eyes scanned the hall, faces she remembered all too well, voices that once cut her like knives. But now those same people lowered their gazes, unsure whether to bow their heads in shame or continue hiding behind false smiles. No one could have imagined this moment. The girl who was once ridiculed, cast aside, and left to struggle alone, now stood in front of them all, not as a beggar, not as a forgotten soul, but as the wife of the man who owned half the town. What they didn't know, however, was that her story was far from over. Her presence tonight would not only silence their laughter, but also uncover secrets that had been buried for years. The music continued, but the air had shifted. The celebration became something else entirely, a stage for a revelation no one expected. Would the villagers finally recognize who she truly was? Would they regret every cruel word, every moment they mocked her? This was not just a party. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And before the night was over, the truth about this woman, the one they once dismissed, would shake the entire hall to its core. Long before the glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors, the woman at the center of the whispers lived a life most in the hall would rather forget. She was born in a small, weathered house at the edge of the town. Her father worked odd jobs, barely earning enough to bring food to the table. Her mother stitched clothes for wealthier families, her hands often raw from endless sewing. Despite the struggles, their little home was filled with warmth, until fate stripped it all away. By the time she was a teenager, her parents were gone. Poverty deepened, and the neighbors, instead of showing compassion, sharpened their cruelty. She became known not by her name, but by her lack of status. That girl, she'll never be anyone. She's only fit for washing floors. Unworthy. No man of respect would ever look at her twice. The words followed her everywhere like shadows she couldn't shake. Children threw stones, women laughed at her patched dresses, and men dismissed her as invisible. Yet beneath their mockery, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She worked tirelessly, washing clothes, fetching water, sweeping streets, anything that would earn her a few coins. But no matter how harsh the world became, she never let bitterness define her. When a hungry child begged, she shared her bread. When an elder struggled to lift a heavy basket, she rushed to help. Her kindness became her armor, though few recognized it. And then there was him, the young heir of one of the wealthiest families in town. He grew up surrounded by everything she lacked: wealth, comfort, and a name that carried power. But privilege came with chains. His family had chosen his future long before he could decide for himself. He was expected to marry someone of equal status, a wealthy, polished bride who would strengthen the family's name. Yet despite the expectations pressing on him, his heart refused to obey. Their worlds collided in small, fleeting moments. Perhaps he saw her helping an old man cross the street while others looked away. Perhaps he noticed her studying by candlelight after a long day of labor, determined to learn what life had denied her. Or maybe it was her quiet resilience, the way she faced humiliation with grace, never surrendering to despair, that drew him closer. To him, she was not unworthy. She was extraordinary. Whispers began when he lingered in the marketplace longer than expected, exchanging words with her. Soon gossip spread like wildfire. Has he lost his mind? Talking to her? He could have any woman, and he chooses a beggar girl? This will shame the family name. The pressure mounted. His family demanded he stop. The townspeople mocked her even more viciously. But in the storm of disapproval, he stood firm. Against all odds, against all expectations, he chose her. It wasn't just a romance, it was a rebellion. His decision shocked everyone. The rich son of a powerful house, willingly walking away from what was proper, and extending his hand to the girl the world had mocked. And she, though overwhelmed, accepted with trembling strength, not because she dreamed of riches, but because someone finally saw her for who she truly was. The world called her unworthy, but he called her his equal, and that choice would change everything. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration, a union of two hearts. Yet for many in the grand hall it was nothing short of scandal. Guests smiled politely for appearances, but their whispers carried sharper blades than any weapon. She doesn't belong here. A poor girl in silk cannot hide her true rags. This marriage will bring nothing but shame, and though she stood beside her husband with trembling hands, she felt each word pierce her like a dagger. From the very beginning, his family made their disapproval clear. His mother, regal and cold, refused to even address her by name. At meals, she would pass dishes around the table but skip her deliberately. His father, a man of wealth and pride, offered only silence. Silence so heavy it drowned out every attempt at warmth. Other relatives were crueler still. At gatherings, they spoke of grand vacations, jewels, and fortunes, always with subtle glances in her direction, as if to remind her she was an outsider. Some cousins mocked her openly, imitating her humble accent or asking loudly, "Do you even know which fork to use?" Laughter would ripple through the room, leaving her humiliated. Society outside the home was no kinder. When she walked into town draped in fine clothes, people did not see grace, they saw a fraud. The whispers followed her like shadows. She must have trapped him somehow. A man like him would never willingly choose her. Mark my words, this won't last long. Invitations to elite gatherings were sent to her husband, but when she arrived at his side, the hosts would greet her with stiff smiles, offering the coldest of welcomes. Often she would find herself alone in a corner, ignored, as though she were invisible. And yet she endured. Never once did she lash out or beg for acceptance. Instead, she carried herself with quiet strength, her silence louder than their insults. While others mocked, she focused on her husband. She listened to his worries, encouraged him when business weighed heavy, and reminded him of the values that truly mattered. Late at night, when he returned exhausted from battling the disapproval of his family, she greeted him not with complaints but with warmth. She would cook meals with her own hands, sit with him in the stillness and say, "As long as we stand together, nothing else matters." Her devotion became his anchor. But not everyone was willing to let them find peace. Behind closed doors, his family plotted ways to end the marriage. Some introduced him to wealthy women, hoping to tempt him into scandal. Others spread rumors, whispering to business partners that his judgment was faltering because of the poor girl. One evening, during a formal dinner, his uncle stood and declared before everyone, "A marriage built on imbalance cannot stand. Our family's reputation is at stake. End this foolishness before it's too late." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, but she did not speak. She lowered her gaze, her hands folded in her lap, and bore the humiliation with quiet grace. Her husband, however, rose with fury. "You see only wealth and status," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "But I see strength, kindness, and loyalty, things money cannot buy. And if you cannot respect her, then you do not respect me." His defense shook the hall, but it also deepened the divide. From that night on, the lines were drawn. The couple on one side, the family and society on the other. Still, she refused to let bitterness take root. When others tried to break her, she only grew stronger. Each insult she endured became proof of her resilience. Each cruel whisper became fuel for her silent determination. They mocked her, excluded her, and tried to tear them apart. But what they didn't know was this: she was not weak. She was waiting, watching. And one day her silence would speak louder than all their cruelty. In the beginning, no one in the wealthy household believed she could contribute anything of value. To them, she was simply the poor girl, a burden their son had foolishly brought home. But small moments, quiet and unnoticed at first, began planting seeds of doubt in her judgment. The household accounts had been mismanaged by a trusted relative, leaving the monthly expenses in chaos. Servants went unpaid and suppliers threatened to withdraw. The family panicked. Voices rose and accusations flew across the room. She sat silently, listening. Then, when the noise became unbearable, she spoke in a calm, steady tone. "If you allow me, I can organize the accounts. I may not know wealth, but I know how to stretch a single coin to feed a family." At first, they laughed. What could she possibly know about managing thousands? But her husband trusted her. He handed her the ledger. That night, by the faint glow of a lamp, she worked through every page. She corrected mistakes, balanced figures, and created a plan that not only saved the household from debt but even reduced waste. By morning, the numbers were clear, precise, and practical. When the suppliers were paid on time and the staff received their wages, even the most skeptical relatives could not hide their astonishment. Another day, an elder from the extended family visited, a stern grandmother known for her sharp tongue and icy judgment. She had openly disapproved of the marriage, refusing to even meet the low-born wife. But during the visit, when a heated debate broke out over a long-forgotten family tradition, the young woman quietly corrected them with surprising accuracy. "Actually," she said softly, "in the old days the custom was not as you think. My grandmother used to tell me stories about this very ritual." Her words, though simple, carried truth. The elder paused, studied her carefully, and for the first time offered the faintest nod of acknowledgement. It was not acceptance, but it was the first crack in the wall of rejection. She also began to win hearts in subtler ways. Servants who once pitied her grew to admire her kindness. When one fell ill, she stayed by their bedside, cooking broth with her own hands. When another was unfairly scolded, she gently defended them, showing courage even in silence. The staff whispered among themselves, "The mistress may be poor in birth, but she is rich in heart." Even the wealthy relatives, though unwilling to admit it, began noticing. When her husband returned home weary, she spoke words that steadied him. When disputes arose, she offered solutions that brought peace. She had the ability to see beyond pride and wealth, to the core of what truly mattered. But still, most dismissed her. They told themselves her successes were luck, her wisdom coincidence. "She is still just a poor girl," they repeated, clinging to their prejudice. They saw her victories but refused to believe. They felt her strength but denied its truth. Yet the seeds had been planted, and one day, they would grow into something too powerful to ignore. One morning, whispers spread through the mansion. The husband's business, once steady, once admired, was on the brink of collapse. A risky deal had backfired. Debts were mounting, and trusted partners had begun to pull away. News of possible bankruptcy threatened not only his future, but the honor of the entire family. The great halls, once filled with laughter and pride, now echoed with frantic arguments. Relatives blamed each other, voices rose in anger, and fingers pointed at her husband for marrying beneath his station. "Had he listened to us," one uncle spat, "we wouldn't be standing on the edge of ruin." In the middle of the storm, she sat silently. Her heart ached for her husband. His shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with shame. She could not watch him drown while others mocked. Finally, she stood. Her voice, though soft, carried an authority no one expected. "Enough." The room fell silent, surprised that she dared to interrupt. "I may not come from wealth," she continued, "but I know how to survive when everything is falling apart. If you allow me, I will help." Gasps filled the room. Some relatives laughed bitterly. What could you possibly know of business? But her husband looked at her with quiet trust, the same trust that had once led him to choose her against the world. He gave a single nod. "Speak." She laid out a bold plan. While others thought only of saving face, she spoke of saving the foundation. She suggested cutting unnecessary luxuries, negotiating directly with smaller suppliers, and opening doors to markets the family had long ignored because they seemed beneath their status. Her proposal was daring, practical, but risky. It meant swallowing pride, admitting mistakes, and working harder than they ever had before. At first, the wealthy relatives shook their heads. "Impossible. Too shameful. We cannot lower ourselves to such levels." But as she explained step by step, their doubts slowly cracked. Every detail showed her sharp mind. Every strategy reflected both wisdom and courage. Her husband looked around the room and said firmly, "We have no choice. We will do as she says." The family hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. In the end, survival outweighed arrogance. They agreed. Days turned into weeks. Under her guidance, the household shifted. Excessive spending stopped. Deals once thought unworthy became lifelines. She visited markets herself, negotiating prices with a confidence that left hardened traders stunned. She spoke with workers directly, restoring their loyalty when many had been ready to abandon the sinking ship. Slowly, the tide turned. The debts lessened, confidence returned, and whispers of recovery spread through the town. But more shocking than the recovery itself was the sight of her leading the charge. This was no longer the poor girl mocked for being unworthy. This was a woman of strength, calm in crisis, fearless in the face of ridicule, and wise beyond measure. They had doubted her. They had laughed at her. But in the moment of greatest darkness, it was her light that kept them from falling apart. And though the family's arrogance was not yet broken, something had shifted. Respect, reluctant, quiet, but undeniable, began to take root. Yet the story was far from over. Because the world outside the mansion had also begun to watch, and soon, they too would see the woman they once mocked in a very different light. The mansion that had once echoed with panic now buzzed with a different energy, the sound of recovery. Her plan, once doubted and mocked, had not only worked but had begun to lift the entire family out of ruin. Suppliers who had once turned their backs now came forward again, eager to work with them. Business partners, impressed by the new strategy, returned to the table with offers of collaboration. Even outsiders in the town who had always whispered behind closed doors about the foolish marriage, now began speaking in awe of the woman who had turned defeat into triumph. Her husband, who had stood humiliated before his own relatives, now walked with pride again, and everywhere he went, people asked the same question: who was behind this change? At first, the family tried to keep the truth quiet. Admitting that the very woman they had once ridiculed was now their savior felt too heavy for their pride to bear. But word travels fast. Servants whispered of her wisdom. Traders spoke of her sharp negotiations, and soon the whole town knew. The poor girl saved them, they said in disbelief. The girl they rejected is the reason they still stand tall. It was the ultimate irony. The same mouths that had once mocked her now sang her praises. The same eyes that had looked down upon her now watched with reluctant admiration. One evening a gathering was held. Relatives, partners, and neighbors filled the grand hall. But this time the whispers were not of scorn. They were whispers of respect, awe, and even a little fear. As she entered the room, dressed simply but with quiet dignity, the crowd fell silent. For the first time they saw her not as the poor girl from nowhere, but as the woman who had risen above them all. She did not boast, nor remind them of their cruelty. She carried herself with the same humility she always had, but her silence now was no longer the silence of weakness. It was the silence of strength, the kind that does not need words to prove itself. Her husband took her hand before everyone and said with pride, "She is the reason we are still standing." "She is my wife, and she is my greatest blessing." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some relatives bowed their heads in shame, remembering every insult they had once thrown her way. Others swallowed hard, forced to admit that the woman they had despised was greater than any of them. The tables had turned. The poor girl they had mocked became the very pillar of their survival. And in that moment, the truth could no longer be denied. She was no longer just part of the family. She was its strength, its honor, and its future. The transformation was complete. She had not only saved the business, but she had saved their name, their dignity, and their pride. And yet in her heart she carried no bitterness. For her, victory was not in their shame, but in proving to herself and to the world that she was more than what they ever believed. But deep within the crowd, not everyone was celebrating. Jealous eyes still lingered, resentment simmered in silence. And though she had won this battle, her journey was far from over. The days that followed felt different. The house that had once carried whispers of doubt now carried only quiet admiration. No one dared to mock her anymore. Even those who had once turned their faces away now lowered their eyes in respect when she passed. But for her, respect did not come from their changed behavior. It came from something deeper, the knowledge that she had proven her worth not through riches but through resilience, wisdom, and an unshakable heart. Her husband stood before everyone. His voice was steady, filled with pride, as he looked at her and then at the faces of those who had doubted her. "I always knew," he said, his hand gently resting on hers, that she was more than what the world saw. And today you all see it too. She is not just my wife. She is the strength of this family. For a moment, silence filled the room. Not the silence of mockery, but the silence of humility. One by one, the elders nodded. The younger ones, who had once laughed at her, lowered their heads in shame. Even those most resistant to her presence could not deny what she had done. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not weep from pain this time. These were tears of release, of knowing that her struggle had not been in vain. She had endured every insult, every slight, and every hardship, not for revenge, but for love, for loyalty, and for the promise she made to herself that she would never be broken. Her husband squeezed her hand, his voice softening. "You gave me strength when I was weak. You gave this family honor when it was nearly lost, and you gave hope when no one else believed. For that I will forever be grateful." The family softened. Walls of pride and prejudice began to crumble. Some came forward to apologize, their voices trembling with regret. Others offered blessings, finally recognizing her as the heart of their household. But she asked for no apologies, no rewards. Her forgiveness came in silence, and the gentle smile she gave as if to say, "I am not here to remind you of the past. I am here because I chose to rise above it." She gained respect not because of wealth, but because of her wisdom. She earned loyalty not through power, but through her courage. And in the end, she stood tall, not as the poor girl they once mocked, but as the woman they could never forget. Her journey had come full circle. She no longer needed to prove herself to the world. She had already won the only victory that mattered: dignity. Once mocked as the poor girl, she had risen above every insult, every whisper, and every barrier. Her journey was more than just survival. It was proof that dignity and strength come not from wealth, but from the heart. When the world looked at her, they saw poverty, weakness, and unworthiness. But when life tested her, she revealed wisdom, resilience, and love beyond measure. In that moment, she became more than a wife, more than a daughter-in-law, more than a woman struggling against scorn. She became a symbol of patience, of faith, and of unshakable courage. For her husband, the answer was clear from the beginning. He had seen her worth when no one else could, and in the end, his faith in her became the very reason the family was saved. But the story may not end here. With respect finally won and a voice finally heard, what will she do next? Will she use her newfound place in the family to help other poor, forgotten souls, those who still suffer the same mockery she once endured? Or will new challenges arise as jealousy and resentment begin to stir among those unwilling to see her shine? The narrator pauses, leaving the audience at the edge of curiosity. Every victory brings a new test, and perhaps her greatest test is yet to come.